The most shocking reality hitting China right now is this: over or 100 million women face an uncertain future because men have simply stopped spending on them, and the so called simp economy has collapsed entirely. Imagine a society where beauty, once seen as a golden ticket to provision and security, has lost its market value overnight, leaving countless women buried in debt with no one willing to bail them out. This video dives deep into the dramatic shift unfolding across China, where economic pressures, changing male priorities, and the oversupply of attractive women have rewritten the rules of dating, relationships, and even basic survival for millions. Stick around until the end, because the hard hitting conclusion reveals how this isn't just a temporary trend, but a permanent awakening that could reshape gender dynamics for generations. And you will not want to miss what it truly means for the future. In recent years across China, something profound and irreversible has taken place in the realm of relationships and economics. A quiet but powerful transformation that has upended long held assumptions about value, desire, and provision. Urban centers from Beijing to Shanghai to Chengdu pulse with an abundance of strikingly beautiful women, dressed impeccably, enhanced by cosmetics and procedures, moving through high end malls and fashionable districts as if beauty itself has become commonplace rather than rare. What was once considered a scarce and precious resource commanding premium attention and investment now saturates the landscape to such an extent that its perceived worth has plummeted dramatically. Men, observing the shift with clear eyes, have begun to recalibrate their behavior in ways that many find startling, choosing instead to direct their hard earned resources toward their own lives, their own growth, and their own security, rather than pouring it into sustaining someone else's lifestyle. This change stems not from bitterness alone, but from a rational assessment of costs and returns in an economy that no longer rewards one sided generosity. The numbers tell a stark story of consumer debt surging among young women, particularly those under 30, where delinquency rates have climbed sharply year after year, often tied directly to spending on aesthetic enhancements, luxury items, and experiences designed to project an image of unattainable status. These expenditures, fueled by easy credit and the lingering belief that external validation would eventually translate into male provision, have created a precarious financial reality for many, one where loans pile upon loans in anticipation of a payoff that never arrives. As economic conditions tighten across the board, the facade of effortless abundance crumbles, exposing the fragility of a system built on leverage and expectation rather than mutual contribution. Wealth in China remains concentrated in the hands of a small elite who possess genuine productive assets and stable cash flows, individuals who understand downturns and prioritize resilience over extravagance. The broader population, including the once aspirational middle class, grapples with depreciating property values, stagnant or reduced incomes, and the constant pressure of financial obligations that leave little room for discretionary spending on romance or courtship. In this environment, the habit of men acting as open wallets for dates, gifts, and lifestyles has eroded rapidly, replaced by a focus on personal stability and self investment. High end restaurants report plummeting occupancy for romantic set meals. Flower sales crash during traditional holidays, and luxury consumption tied to impressing partners drops significantly as men opt for takeout, personal hobbies, technology, and experiences that benefit themselves directly. This withdrawal is not random or spiteful, but a logical response to repeated patterns where material giving failed to yield lasting emotional or relational returns, often leaving the giver feeling exploited rather than appreciated. The result is a marketplace where supply far outstrips demand, where women who once commanded attention through appearance alone now find themselves competing in a space that values productivity, character, and self sufficiency far more than surface level allure. The consequences ripple outward in profound ways, affecting not just individual relationships, but broader social and economic structures. Women who invested heavily in their external presentation, borrowing against future earnings or male generosity to maintain a certain image, discover that beauty depreciates quickly when everyone has access to similar enhancements and when economic survival demands more substantive contributions. Debt accumulates from cosmetic procedures, designer goods, and curated social media personas, all built on the outdated premise that such investments would attract providers willing to shoulder the burden. Yet, as men collectively step back, prioritizing savings, skill building, and independence, that premise collapses, leaving many facing mounting bills without the anticipated rescue. This dynamic highlights a deeper truth about value creation, that true worth emerges from what one produces and sustains independently rather than what one consumes or displays. In a time of global economic uncertainty, the ability to stand on one's own becomes the ultimate asset, while reliance on external provision turns into a liability. Men, awakening to this reality, embrace solitude and self directed living as sources of peace and control, finding fulfillment in pursuits that do not depend on another person's approval or reciprocation. The shift represents a form of collective evolution where outdated transactional models give way to more balanced expectations rooted in mutual respect and genuine compatibility. This transformation did not occur in isolation, but built gradually through years of changing incentives and cultural signals. Consumerism promoted the idea that appearance equated to capital, encouraging women to leverage credit for upgrades that promised higher returns in the dating market. Social platforms amplified this message, showcasing lifestyles that seemed attainable through the right partnerships, yet rarely delivered on the promise once economic headwinds arrived. Meanwhile, men observed the imbalance, recognizing that excessive giving often led to entitlement rather than partnership, prompting a reevaluation of priorities toward personal development and financial caution. Holidays once marked by lavish gestures now pass quietly, with declining sales of symbolic items underscoring the broader retreat from performative romance. The data on delinquency rates, unpaid balances, and shifting consumption patterns paints a clear picture of a system correcting itself, where unsustainable behaviors face natural consequences. Women caught in this cycle confront harsh lessons about overextension and misplaced confidence, while men gain clarity on boundaries and self worth. The narrative unfolding is one of adaptation, where both sides must navigate a new landscape defined by realism rather than illusion. As this reality settles in, the implications extend beyond personal finances into questions of societal progress and individual agency. When provision ceases to be automatic, it forces a reckoning with what truly sustains a life of dignity and purpose. Beauty, divorced from productivity or character, reveals itself as fleeting, unable to withstand economic pressures or shifting preferences. The abundance of attractive women, enhanced by widespread access to tools of enhancement, paradoxically diminishes individual leverage, turning what was once a competitive advantage into a neutral trait. Men, no longer compelled to compete through wallets, redirect energy toward building lives of substance, from career advancement to hobbies that foster genuine satisfaction. This redirection benefits society by encouraging innovation and self reliance, countering the drain of resources into non productive cycles. For women, the path forward lies in cultivating skills, financial independence, and inner confidence that do not rely on external validation, transforming potential vulnerability into strength. The collapse of one sided dynamics opens space for healthier connections built on equality and shared effort, though the transition brings discomfort for those accustomed to old patterns. The intensity of this shift becomes evident in everyday observations across China's cities, where once bustling scenes of courtship fade into quieter routines of individual focus. Men gather with friends over simple meals, invest in personal fitness or education, and save aggressively against future uncertainties, finding contentment in autonomy. Women, facing the pinch of unpaid debts and reduced options, reassess priorities, some turning towards self improvement, while others struggle with the abrupt change. The economy itself reflects this pivot, with luxury sectors tied to romantic spending, contracting, while practical and self oriented consumption holds steady or grows. This is not a rejection of relationships altogether, but a demand for reciprocity and realism in an era where survival trumps spectacle. The awakening spreads organically, reinforced by shared experiences and online discussions that highlight the pitfalls of outdated approaches. Men who once emptied accounts for fleeting approval now guard their resources jealously, understanding that true peace comes from within rather than from appeasing external expectations. What emerges from this landscape is a clearer understanding of human incentives and the limits of artificial scarcity. When beauty floods the market through technology and consumerism, its exchange value drops, much like any oversupplied commodity. Men, responding to this glut, withdraw investment, accelerating the devaluation and forcing adaptation. The process, though painful for some, drives progress toward more authentic interactions and personal accountability. Societies thrive when individuals build from solid foundations rather than borrowed appearances, and this moment in China illustrates that principle in real time. The story continues to unfold, with millions navigating the aftermath, learning hard but valuable lessons about value, effort, and independence. And the transformation sweeping through China's relationship landscape continues to deepen with every passing month, revealing layers of consequence that touch everything from personal mental health to national demographic trends, and even subtle shifts in workplace dynamics. What began as individual men making pragmatic choices about where to allocate their limited financial resources has snowballed into a cultural recalibration that challenges decades of assumptions about gender roles, economic provision, and the very definition of partnership in modern society. Young men in their 20s and early 30s, many of whom grew up watching their fathers or older brothers pour substantial portions of income into courtship rituals, weddings, housing deposits, and ongoing support, now look at those same patterns and see inefficiency rather than tradition. They witness friends who committed heavily only to face divorce settlements, alimony pressures, or simply emotional exhaustion from relationships that felt more like sponsorships than equal unions. This observation breeds caution, then detachment, and finally a deliberate pivot toward lifestyles that prioritize personal accumulation over relational expenditure. Savings accounts grow steadily. Investment portfolios expand modestly but consistently. Travel becomes solo or with male friends. And evenings once reserved for dates now fill with gym sessions, online courses, gaming communities, or quiet reading. The peace that comes from this redirection proves addictive for many, creating a feedback loop where reduced spending on women reinforces the benefits of independence, which in turn encourages even greater financial discipline and emotional self reliance. Meanwhile, the women positioned at the center of the shift experience the change in acutely personal terms, often without the buffer of accumulated assets or fallback support systems that previous generations might have relied upon. The generation entering adulthood after the one child policy era inherited a world of intense competition, skyrocketing living costs, and social media that relentlessly compared our appearances and lifestyles. Many responded by doubling down on external presentation, viewing it as the fastest route to upward mobility through advantageous partnerships. Cosmetic treatments ranging from subtle fillers to more extensive surgeries became normalized, financed through installment plans or credit cards with promotional zero interest periods that quietly transitioned into high rates once the promotional window closed. Fashion followed the same logic, with wardrobes built around seasonal trends sourced from live streaming platforms offering easy payment options. Social outings shifted toward venues that signaled status, meals photographed for instant sharing, and experiences curated for maximum visual impact. All of this rested on an implicit bet that the investment would attract a man willing and able to assume the financial lead long term. When that bet fails to pay off because the pool of willing providers shrinks dramatically, the fallout manifests as stress, anxiety, and in many cases, spiraling debt that compounds monthly. Collection calls increase, credit scores deteriorate, and the ability to maintain even basic appearances becomes strained, creating a vicious cycle where reduced attractiveness in the eyes of potential partners further limits options for rescue or relief. Economic data emerging from various provinces underscores how widespread this pattern has become, with consumer loan defaults among women aged 18 to 35 rising at rates that outpace those of their male counterparts by significant margins in several major cities. Reports from financial institutions indicate that a substantial portion of these non performing loans ties directly back to lifestyle and beauty related spending rather than necessities such as housing or education. The disparity highlights a fundamental mismatch between perceived and actual economic realities. While official statistics continue to celebrate rising female workforce participation and educational attainment, the private financial picture tells a different story for a sizable segment of the population that banked heavily on relational capital rather than earned capital. Men, by contrast, appear to be accelerating their own financial preparations, with male savings rates climbing in surveys conducted across urban areas. This divergence creates a widening gap in financial resilience, one that becomes painfully evident during economic slowdowns when safety nets prove thin or non existent. Parents, themselves often stretched by retirement concerns or ongoing property mortgage payments, find they have little capacity to absorb their adult daughter's financial shortfalls. Government assistance programs, focused primarily on poverty alleviation or elderly care, offer minimal coverage for the kind of consumer debt accumulated through discretionary spending. The result leaves many women confronting a stark choice between drastic lifestyle contraction, additional borrowing at punitive rates, or seeking employment in fields that pay quickly, even if the work carries lower social prestige. This moment of reckoning forces a broader societal conversation about the sustainability of models that treat provision as a default male obligation rather than a negotiated outcome of mutual value creation. Traditional expectations, reinforced through media, family teachings, and cultural narratives, position men as natural providers whose success measured partly by their willingness to extend resources outward. Yet, as economic growth moderates, housing prices stagnate or decline in many Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities, and job security becomes less certain even for college graduates. Those expectations collide with harsh fiscal mathematics. A man earning a respectable but not extravagant salary in a coastal metropolis can no longer comfortably support both his own ambitions and the lifestyle demands of a partner accustomed to consistent upgrades and indulgences. The math simply does not add up without sacrificing long term security, retirement planning, or personal goals. Recognizing this, increasing numbers opt out of the equation entirely, choosing singleness or casual arrangements that carry minimal financial entanglement. The decision gained social legitimacy through online communities where men share stories of past overextension and current contentment, normalizing what was once viewed as selfish or immature behavior. Phrases once used pejoratively to shame non providing men lose their sting when the alternative, solitude paired with financial peace, proves genuinely preferable for a growing cohort. Women navigating this new terrain encounter a double challenge. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Adapting to diminished leverage while simultaneously rebuilding from a position of financial strain. Some respond constructively, pursuing skill upgrades, launching side businesses, or relocating to regions with lower living costs and emerging opportunities. Others resist the shift, doubling down on appearance maintenance in the hope that persistence will eventually restore the old dynamic. The latter approach tends to accelerate debt accumulation without reversing the underlying trend, as men continue to prioritize observable productivity and emotional stability over polished exteriors alone. The contrast becomes visible in dating app interactions, where profiles emphasizing career achievements, hobbies, and financial independence receive markedly higher engagement from serious minded men than those focused primarily on aesthetics or lifestyle signaling. This filtering mechanism reinforces the message that value in the modern marketplace derives from what one contributes rather than what one consumes or displays. The lesson, though delivered through discomfort, carries long term potential for healthier relational patterns where both parties enter as self sufficient adults capable of genuine partnership rather than dependency. Beyond the individual level, the phenomenon influences broader demographic patterns already concerning policymakers. Marriage rates, already declining steadily for more than a decade, accelerate in regions where economic pressures hit hardest and male withdrawal appears most pronounced. Birth rates follow a parallel downward trajectory, compounding existing population aging challenges. Government campaigns encouraging marriage and childbirth meet with limited success when the underlying economic incentives point in the opposite direction. Young men cite financial burdens of family formation as a primary deterrent, while young women express frustration at the scarcity of partners willing to meet traditional provider expectations. The impasse suggests that surface level incentives, such as subsidies or propaganda, prove insufficient when core economic realities shift so dramatically. Addressing the root causes requires acknowledging that relational decisions increasingly hinge on perceived fairness, reciprocity, and mutual benefit rather than inherited gender scripts. Until those perceptions align more closely with present day conditions, the trend toward delayed or foregone family formation seems likely to persist, carrying implications for labor markets, social welfare systems, and national economic vitality over the coming decades. The psychological dimension of the shift deserves equal attention, as both men and women grapple with altered expectations and identities in a compressed time frame. For men, the embrace of solitude often brings an unexpected sense of liberation once initial social conditioning wears off. Freed from the pressure to perform provider roles, many report improved focus, reduced anxiety around money, and deeper engagement with personal interests previously sidelined. Friendships strengthen around shared non relational pursuits. Mental health improves through boundaries rather than appeasement. And overall, life satisfaction rises in surveys tracking self reported happiness among single men in their late 20s and 30s. The absence of constant relational expenditure translates into tangible freedom, whether that means pursuing advanced certifications, building side income streams, or simply enjoying unstructured time without guilt. This positive reinforcement sustains the behavior, turning what began as a defensive withdrawal into an affirmative lifestyle choice embraced with confidence. For women, the adjustment period proves more turbulent, marked by disillusionment, anger, and eventual reevaluation. Initial reactions frequently involve blaming men for becoming selfish or immature, yet prolonged exposure to unchanged outcomes forces introspection in many cases. Online discussions among women reveal growing acknowledgement that beauty alone no longer suffices as currency, prompting some to pivot toward education, entrepreneurship, or career advancement with renewed urgency. Others seek communities that validate their frustrations while offering practical strategies for adaptation rather than nostalgia for lost leverage. The process, though uneven and often painful, plants seeds for greater autonomy and resilience, qualities that ultimately serve individuals better in an unpredictable economic environment. Relationships that do form under these conditions tend to carry stronger foundations built on demonstrated compatibility and shared responsibility rather than unilateral provision. The net effect points toward evolution rather than collapse, where outdated imbalances correct themselves through market like pressures and incentives. As the cycle continues, certain patterns solidify into observable norms across urban China. Dating culture tilts toward low cost or no cost interactions, with coffee meetups replacing elaborate dinners and public parks or casual walks substituting for high end venues. Men openly state preferences for partners who display financial responsibility and personal ambition, while women increasingly highlight their own accomplishments and independence in profiles and conversations. The performative elements of courtship diminish, replaced by straightforward assessments of long term compatibility. Luxury consumption tied to signaling partner value declines further, redirecting spending toward experiences or assets that benefit the individual directly. These micro shifts accumulate into macro changes, influencing retail trends, real estate demand, and even entertainment preferences as people orient more towards self focused consumption. The economy adapts accordingly, with sectors catering to solo lifestyles or practical needs gaining ground, while those reliant on romantic extravagance contract or pivot. This ongoing realignment underscores a timeless principle. Value flows toward utility and sustainability rather than scarcity alone when scarcity proves artificial or temporary. Beauty, once artificially scarce through limited access to enhancement, becomes abundant through technology, affordability, and cultural normalization. When abundance meets economic constraint, the premium once attached to appearance evaporates, compelling all parties to compete on different dimensions. Men gain by conserving resources and building inward strength. Women gain by developing substantive capabilities that endure beyond youth or trends. Society gains through reduced wasteful expenditure and increased productivity from individuals focused on creation rather than consumption. The story unfolding in China serves as a case study in rapid adaptation, demonstrating how quickly incentives can reshape behavior when underlying conditions change decisively. The momentum behind this cultural and economic pivot in China shows no signs of reversing as it enters its most entrenched phase, where what started as scattered individual decisions has hardened into widespread behavioral norms that younger generations now accept as baseline reality rather than deviation. Boys coming of age in the mid 2010s and beyond grow up absorbing the lesson early through observation, Online forums, viral short videos, and overheard conversations among older brothers or cousins that the classic provider script leads to exhaustion, resentment, and frequently financial ruin rather than gratitude or lasting companionship. They see uncles who worked 60-hour weeks only to fund endless upgrades in a partner's lifestyle, friends who took on crushing mortgage debt for apartments sized for families that never materialized, and influencers who once preached the gospel of spoiling women now openly admit they were played and are happier, broke free, and alone. This collective memory imprints deeply, producing a cohort of young men who approach romantic prospects with the same guarded pragmatism they apply to job offers, investments, or major purchases. Courtship becomes transactional in reverse, meaning the default is zero commitment of resources until extraordinary evidence of long term mutual benefit emerges. Casual interactions stay casual, financial exposure stays minimal, and emotional investment remains conditional on consistent reciprocity demonstrated over months rather than days or weeks. The old courtship timeline: meet, impress with generosity, escalate spending, secure commitment has been replaced by a much longer probationary period where both parties must prove value without heavy unilateral transfers. This extended evaluation phase reshapes everything from first date expectations to the living arrangement decisions. Coffee shops and inexpensive noodle stands replace upscale venues as standard meeting spots, not out of stinginess, but out of mutual understanding that extravagant displays early on signal desperation or manipulation rather than genuine interest. Men arrive with the unspoken rule that they cover their own share unless the woman explicitly insists on equality or offers to pay. And even then, many politely decline to avoid creating any precedent of obligation. Conversations steer away from lifestyle fantasies toward practical topics such as career trajectories, savings habits, family obligations, and long term goals, filtering quickly for alignment or incompatibility. Women who attempt to steer discussions back toward hints of provision or subtle tests of generosity find the tactic backfiring as men recognize the pattern and disengage politely but firmly. The result is a dating environment that feels colder and more businesslike to those accustomed to the prior romantic script, yet paradoxically more honest and less exploitative for those who value clarity over illusion. Rejection comes faster and cleaner, sparing both sides prolonged investment in mismatched dynamics. Compatibility emerges as the primary currency, with financial self sufficiency treated as a non negotiable prerequisite rather than an optional bonus. For women still operating under older assumptions, this shift registers as rejection on a mass scale, producing widespread frustration that spills into public discourse, viral complaints, and occasionally organized online pushback against what gets labeled male selfishness or immaturity. Yet, the louder the complaints grow, the more they reinforce the very withdrawal they decry, as men witness the backlash and double down on their resolve to avoid entanglements that come packaged with resentment. Social media algorithms amplify the cycle, pushing stories of aggrieved women to male feeds where they serve as cautionary tales, while male contentment narratives circulate among women as evidence that the strategy works. The polarization entrenches positions further, turning what could have been a quiet recalibration into a visible culture, war fought through memes, debate threads, and dueling short form videos. One side frames the change as liberation from outdated burdens. The other frames it as abandonment of traditional duties. Neither fully acknowledges the economic root cause. That provision at scale became mathematically unsustainable for the median earner in a stagnating or contracting middle class environment. When housing, education, healthcare, and retirement costs consume ever larger shares of income while wages grow slowly or not at all, the surplus once available for romantic signaling simply evaporates for most. What looks like a moral failing to one group registers as basic arithmetic to the other. Policymakers and sociologists tracking these developments express growing alarm over secondary effects that extend far beyond the bedroom. Marriage registration numbers continue their multi year plunge, dropping into territory that alarms demographers who project severe labor shortages and pension system strain within 2 decades. Local governments experiment with incentives ranging from cash bonuses for newlyweds to priority housing lotteries for couples. Yet uptake remains tepid because the financial calculus young people perform privately outweighs any one time subsidy. A couple 100,000 yuan spread over several years pales next to the perceived lifetime cost of supporting a partner whose spending habits were formed during the peak consumption years. Births follow the same downward path, with fertility rates in major cities dipping below levels seen even in Japan or South Korea during their steepest declines. The one child policy legacy already skewed gender ratios in some cohorts, but the current refusal to form families at all creates a different kind of imbalance, one of missing children rather than missing women. Rural areas where traditional expectations lingered longer begin showing similar patterns as younger men migrate back from cities with urban attitudes intact, bringing the provider opt out mentality to smaller towns and villages. The labor market reflects these changes in subtle but measurable ways. Single men, unburdened by family formation expenses, display greater willingness to take risks such as job changes, entrepreneurship, or relocation for better opportunities. They work longer hours when it pays, invest more aggressively in skill acquisition, and save at rates that allow quicker accumulation of personal capital. Employers in competitive sectors quietly favor these profiles for promotions and high stakes projects because the absence of domestic financial pressure correlates with higher availability and focus. Women, particularly those carrying consumer debt or facing reduced partner options, sometimes compensate by pushing harder in their own careers, leading to pockets of accelerated female advancement in fields that value output over appearance. Yet for others, the debt burden acts as an anchor, limiting mobility, forcing acceptance of lower paying or less desirable jobs simply to service payments, and creating chronic stress that reduces productivity and job satisfaction. The net effect on overall workforce dynamism appears mixed. Some gain freedom and ambition, others lose leverage and face prolonged financial drag. Retail and service sectors adjust in real time to the new spending priorities. Luxury brands that once relied on gifting and couple oriented consumption report softer demand in China compared with other major markets, prompting steeper discounts, localized marketing pivots towards self purchase empowerment, or outright store closures in secondary cities. Flower delivery services, high end dessert chains, and romantic getaway packages see revenue declines that force business model reinvention or contraction. Meanwhile, sectors catering to solo male lifestyles thrive. Premium gaming peripherals, high end fitness equipment, single serve gourmet meal kits, personal development courses, and travel experiences marketed explicitly to independent travelers all post strong growth. The economy slowly reorients around individual rather than couple based consumption, a shift that mirrors broader global trends but accelerates faster in China due to the sharpness of the relational withdrawal. Mental health statistics begin capturing the human cost and benefit of this transition. Psychologists report rising cases of anxiety and depression among women in their late 20s and early 30s who feel trapped between old expectations and new realities, with themes of betrayal, worthlessness, and hopelessness recurring in therapy sessions. At the same time, male mental health indicators show improvement in several urban centers, with lower reported rates of stress related disorders, higher life satisfaction scores among singles, and increased participation in community sports, hobby groups, and volunteer activities that replace relational energy. The divergence suggests that the same event, mass male disengagement from provision, produces opposite emotional outcomes depending on prior investment in the old model. Those who built identity around being desired and provided for suffer the hardest. Those who built identity around independence and self mastery weather the storm with relative ease. As the decade progresses, certain adaptations begin to crystallize into new cultural scripts. Dating shows pivot toward formats that emphasize financial transparency, career compatibility, and shared values over dramatic reveals or extravagant dates. Matchmaking services market themselves as facilitators of pragmatic partnerships rather than fairy tale romances. Young women increasingly post content celebrating their own financial milestones: first solo apartment purchase, debt payoff, business launch, positioning independence as aspirational rather than defensive. Men share stories of turning down high maintenance prospects without apology, framing the choice as self respect rather than cruelty. These micro narratives accumulate into a new common sense that provision is earned through demonstrated partnership rather than assumed through gender. The transition remains uneven, with coastal megacities leading the change, while inland regions and older generations lag, creating visible cultural fault lines. Yet, the direction appears set. Relational value will increasingly derive from what each person brings independently rather than what one extracts from the other. This long arc of adjustment carries lessons that reach beyond China, offering a preview of what happens when economic constraints meet cultural lag. When the material base that supported a particular gender script erodes, the script does not bend gently. It breaks, and people scramble to build new ones amid the debris. The pain of that breaking falls heaviest on those who invested most heavily in the obsolete model, while those who stayed light footed or never bought an escape relatively unscathed. Over time, the wreckage clears, new equilibria form, and society moves forward with slightly different assumptions about what constitutes a viable life. China's current chapter illustrates that process in accelerated motion, compressing decades of gradual change into a handful of years through the combined pressure of debt, abundance, stagnation, and digital amplification. The outcome remains unfinished, but the trajectory points toward greater individual sovereignty, less performative romance, and partnerships, if they form at all, rooted in realism rather than tradition or fantasy. As the calendar flips deeper into the 2020s and early signs of permanence appear, Chinese society begins reorganizing around the assumption that large scale male provision is no longer a reliable default. Urban planning departments in Tier 1 cities quietly adjust zoning and development priorities to accommodate a rising share of single occupancy households and smaller co living arrangements designed for independent adults rather than nuclear families. Developers market micro apartments under 40 square meters as premium lifestyle choices, complete with high speed internet, compact gyms, and shared rooftop gardens that foster low commitment, neighborly interaction without the obligations of traditional family compounds. Real estate agents report stronger demand for properties near business districts, public transit hubs, and recreational areas that support solo or small group living, while demand for oversized 3 and 4 bedroom units in suburban developments softens noticeably outside of family oriented pockets. The physical built environment starts mirroring the social one, more compact, more flexible, more oriented toward individual autonomy than collective provision. Education and career trajectories shift in tandem as young people internalize the new math of independence. High school and university counseling increasingly includes modules on personal finance, debt management, and long term net worth planning that frame relationships as optional enhancers rather than core economic pillars. Career fairs feature booths from companies highlighting remote work options, side hustle support, and flexible schedules that allow individuals to build parallel income streams without relying on a partner's contribution. Young women, especially those who witnessed older sisters or friends struggle with consumer debt hangovers, gravitate towards STEM fields, vocational certifications in emerging tech like AI operations and renewable energy maintenance, and entrepreneurial incubators that promise scalable earnings independent of marital status. Men continue pouring into high earning but demanding sectors: software engineering, quantitative finance, logistics optimization, where over time, pay and bonuses can compound quickly when not diverted into relational overhead. The result is a workforce that skews toward hyper productive individualism, with companies benefiting from longer retention in key roles because employees face fewer pressures to exit for family formation or relocation tied to a spouse's career. Government and corporate responses grow more creative as the demographic data refuses to bend. Beyond the well publicized subsidies and tax tweaks, some provinces pilot programs that bundle matchmaking services with financial literacy workshops, framing partnership as a joint venture requiring balanced ledgers from day one. State backed apps emerge that match users based partly on shared savings goals, debt to income ratios, and investment philosophies alongside personality and values, attempting to filter for economic compatibility before emotional attachment forms. Large employers in tech and manufacturing introduce single professional benefits packages, hire 401k style matching for unmarried staff, priority access to company dorms or subsidized housing, and wellness stipends earmarked for solo travel or hobby development, implicitly recognizing that a growing segment of the workforce plans to remain unpartnered long term. These measures acknowledge the reality without directly confronting the withdrawal dynamic head on, focusing instead on making independence more comfortable and sustainable while leaving room for those who still choose partnership to do so on revised terms. International observers begin drawing explicit parallels between China's experience and similar trends unfolding elsewhere, though with important differences in speed and scale. In South Korea and Japan, where fertility rates plunged earlier, men also stepped back from traditional provider roles amid stagnant wages, high housing costs, and shifting female expectations, leading to phenomena like herbivore men and Soshoku Danshi, who prioritize personal fulfillment over family headship. Yet China's version arrives with greater intensity because the beauty enhancement industry saturated the market so rapidly through affordable tech and credit, creating an oversupply shock that devalued appearance based leverage faster than in slower moving societies. Western commentators note echoes in rising male singleness rates in the United States and parts of Europe, where online discourse around MGT How, passport bros, and financial red pilling mirrors the pragmatic detachment seen in Chinese cities, though cultural individualism was already baked in rather than emerging as a reaction to collapsed expectations. The common thread across these contexts is clear. When the cost benefit equation of provision tips decisively negative for the median man, withdrawal follows as rational self preservation, forcing societies to adapt infrastructure, incentives, and narratives around a reality where fewer people form traditional households. Looking further ahead, projections from demographers and economists sketch a China in the 2030s and 2040s that looks markedly different from the high growth, family centric model of the 2000s and early 2010s. Population decline accelerates before eventually stabilizing at a lower equilibrium, with an older median age and a dependency ratio that strains pension and healthcare systems, but also concentrates resources among fewer workers. Labor productivity rises through automation, AI integration, and relentless skill upgrading as individuals compete on output rather than relational capital. Consumer markets continue reorienting towards solo and small group consumption, premium single serve appliances, personalized health tech, virtual reality social spaces, and longevity focused services gain massive traction, while legacy family oriented sectors contract or pivot. Gender dynamics settle into a new baseline where partnerships form later, smaller, and more pragmatically, often after both parties have achieved independent stability. Divorce rates may stabilize or even decline among those who do marry because entry barriers are higher and exit costs clearer from the start. Social cohesion shifts from kinship networks toward chosen communities built around shared interests, professional affiliations, or geographic proximity, creating resilience through diversity rather than uniformity. The psychological legacy of this transition proves enduring. A generation raised to expect provision as a birthright learns through hard experience that security comes from within or through balanced exchange rather than unilateral transfer. Men who walked away early carry forward a quiet confidence born of proven self reliance, viewing solitude not as failure, but as mastery. Women who rebuilt from debt and disillusionment emerge with sharper boundaries, diversified income, and a sense of agency that no longer hinges on external rescue. Both sides, having lived through the rupture, approach any future relationships with eyes wide open, demanding transparency about finances, clear division of labor, and mutual growth rather than one sided sacrifice. The cultural memory of the simp economy collapse becomes a cautionary chapter taught in subtle ways through family conversations, media references, and personal finance education that warns against over leveraging identity on relational promises. This arc, from abundance driven illusion to constraint driven realism, ultimately strengthens the society that survives it. Resources once bled into non productive signaling cycles now fuel innovation, infrastructure, and personal development at scale. Individuals stand taller because they must. Connections form cleaner because they can no longer hide behind money. The harsh correction, painful as it was for millions caught mid transition, clears space for a more honest equilibrium where value is created rather than assumed, earned rather than demanded, and sustained through reciprocity rather than expectation. China, having compressed decades of social evolution into a few turbulent years, emerges leaner, more pragmatic, and, paradoxically, more capable of weathering whatever economic storms come next. The transformation has now reached a point where it no longer feels like a reaction to a single economic shock, but a foundational rewrite of how an entire generation defines how worth, security, and purpose. By late 2025 and into 2026, the behavioral patterns that started in coastal megacities have migrated inland, crossed generational lines in subtle ways and begun influencing institutional decisions that will shape the next 30 years. State owned enterprises and private conglomerates alike adjust hiring, promotion, and retention strategies around the emerging profile of the high performing single professional. Performance reviews increasingly weigh individual output metrics, lines of code committed, patents filed, sales closed, projects delivered, over vague notions of team harmony or family stability that once served as soft signals of reliability. Managers notice that employees without heavy domestic financial commitments show up earlier, stay later without complaint, volunteer for overseas assignments, and rarely request extended leave beyond statutory minimums. The unspoken preference for this profile becomes visible in faster career tracks for those who remain unencumbered, creating a quiet sorting mechanism that rewards self contained ambition over relational entanglement. This corporate tilt reinforces the cycle at the individual level. Young men watch senior colleagues in their 40s and 50s who stayed single or divorced early accumulate private wealth at rates that dwarf their married peers. The math becomes impossible to ignore. Compound interest on savings untouched by wedding costs, down payments for a second property, private school tuition, or ongoing lifestyle subsidies produces visible differences in net worth by mid career. Conversations in company canteens and late night work chats turn candid about the advantages of keeping overhead low, fewer dependents, lower recurring expenses, greater ability to weather layoffs or industry downturns. The narrative shifts from viewing singleness as a temporary phase to treating it as a strategic long game position. Some even frame it in patriotic terms, arguing that concentrating resources in fewer hands allows faster capital formation, higher risk tolerance for entrepreneurship, and ultimately greater contributions to national productivity during a period of global competition and demographic contraction. Women who have successfully navigated the pivot display a parallel but distinct form of strategic adaptation. Those who cleared consumer debt, built emergency funds equivalent to 12 to 18 months of expenses, and secured income streams that do not depend on physical presence or youth enter their 30s with leverage that previous cohorts rarely possessed at the same age. They negotiate harder in job interviews, demand equity packages or performance bonuses, relocate for better opportunities without hesitation, and invest aggressively in index funds, overseas property, or small scale real estate crowdfunding. The psychological shift is profound. Security no longer feels contingent on finding a generous partner, but on controlling one's own cash flow and asset base. Social media accounts, once filled with luxury hauls, now showcase milestone achievements, paying off the last installment on a car loan, closing on a studio apartment, hitting a six-figure annual income through combined salary and side business. These posts garner engagement from peers who see the trajectory as attainable and aspirational, slowly normalizing financial independence as the new status marker for women in urban China. The dating and marriage markets themselves undergo a structural consolidation. Traditional matchmaking corners in public parks shrink as older generations retire from the role, replaced by algorithm driven platforms that incorporate economic compatibility filters from the outset. Users must upload recent bank statements, credit reports, or notarized income certificates to unlock premium matching tiers, turning what was once a discrete private matter into a transparent prerequisite. Profiles list monthly disposable income after fixed obligations, debt service ratios, and investment portfolios alongside height, education, and hobbies. The openness reduces ghosting and mismatched expectations, but also shrinks the pool of viable pairings dramatically. Many users report cycling through hundreds of profiles only to find a handful that align on both emotional and fiscal dimensions. When connections do form, early conversations revolve around spreadsheet level discussions, how household bills will split, whether joint accounts make sense, contingency plans for job loss or illness, and prenuptial agreements that protect premarital assets. The process feels clinical to outsiders, yet produces unions with far lower dissolution risk because unrealistic expectations get surfaced and resolved before legal ties bind. Beyond the personal sphere, the shift begins reshaping public policy in ways that acknowledge the new demographic arithmetic without directly naming the male withdrawal as cause. Child care subsidies expand to cover single parents and unmarried individuals pursuing assisted reproduction, reflecting recognition that traditional two parent households will not rebound to previous levels. Pension reforms accelerate the retirement age incrementally while increasing contribution requirements, implicitly betting on longer working lives among a population with fewer dependents to support. Urban renewal projects prioritize age friendly infrastructure, accessible public transport, community health clinics, green spaces designed for solo exercise, because planners project a higher proportion of older adults living alone rather than with adult children. Education policy introduces mandatory financial literacy curricula starting in middle school, teaching compound interest, credit risk, lifestyle inflation, and the long term cost of unequal household economics. The curriculum avoids moralizing about gender roles but presents clear simulations showing how different life choices, early marriage with high consumption versus delayed family formation with aggressive saving, affect net worth at age 60. Students leave these classes with a mental model that treats relationships as optional variables in a larger personal balance sheet equation. Internationally, Chinese academics and think tank researchers publish comparative studies that frame the phenomenon as an accelerated version of trends already visible in other high pressure East Asian economies. They note that while Japan experienced a slower, more culturally muted withdrawal from traditional family roles, China's version compressed the timeline through the explosive growth of social media driven consumption and beauty augmentation. South Korea's similar retreat into individualism came with heavier state intervention in housing and fertility policy. China, by contrast, has leaned more on market signals and cultural adaptation, letting the correction run its course with less direct interference. Western analysts observing from afar draw uneasy parallels to their own rising rates of voluntary childlessness and delayed partnership, wondering whether China's experience foreshadows a broader decoupling of economic productivity from family formation across developed and semi developed societies. The question they pose repeatedly is whether a nation can sustain high innovation and output with persistently low fertility and shrinking cohorts, or whether new forms of social organization, perhaps built around extended chosen families, professional guilds, or AI mediated companionship, will emerge to fill the gaps left by conventional kinship structures. Looking toward the 2030s, econometric models run by university research centers project several plausible paths. In the baseline scenario, population stabilizes around 1.1 to 1.2 billion by mid century after an extended decline, with an age pyramid heavily weighted toward the upper brackets. Labor force participation remains high due to delayed retirement and continued female workforce engagement, while automation offsets raw headcount losses in manufacturing and services. Consumption tilts decisively toward health, longevity, leisure, and technology products that cater to solo or small group living. Real estate markets bifurcate further. Premium micro units and senior co housing thrive in cities, while rural areas see accelerated consolidation as younger people refuse to return. Government revenue from property taxes and consumption levies holds steady despite fewer households because per capita wealth concentrates among those who avoided early relational overhead. Social welfare spending rises to cover elder care and chronic disease management, but avoids ballooning into unsustainable levels thanks to higher savings rates accumulated during prime working years. An alternative high innovation path assumes that the freedom from family formation costs unleashes a wave of entrepreneurship and technical breakthroughs. Freed up capital flows into startups, research grants, and overseas acquisitions, positioning China as a leader in AI driven healthcare, personalized medicine, robotics for elder assistance, and virtual reality environments that reduce isolation without requiring physical cohabitation. Fertility does not rebound significantly, but quality adjusted life years increase dramatically, and subjective well being surveys show stable or rising scores among middle aged and older cohorts who report greater control over their lives. The trade off is a smaller but more concentrated creative and scientific class driving disproportionate progress. A third, more pessimistic projection sees widening inequality between those who adapted early and those who did not. The prudent savers and career maximizers pull far ahead, while late adapters or those burdened by legacy debt remain trapped in lower wage cycles, creating visible geographic and class divides. Social tension rises in pockets where resentment festers, among women who feel permanently disadvantaged by the withdrawal, among men who feel demonized for choosing self preservation, among older generations who view the entire shift as a betrayal of Confucian family values. Policy attempts to bridge the gap through redistribution or moral suasion meet resistance from a population that has internalized individualism as survival strategy. Regardless of which path materializes, the core lesson etched into the cultural record is unambiguous. When the economic scaffolding that held up a particular gender bargain collapses, people do not cling to the wreckage indefinitely. They build new scaffolding, smaller, more modular, more self contained, and learn to live atop it. The generation that lived through the collapse carries the memory as both warning and empowerment. They teach their younger siblings and eventual mentees that value is not bestowed by biology or tradition, but constructed through discipline, adaptability, and refusal to over leverage one's future on promises that markets can no longer honor. In that refusal lies the seed of a different kind of strength, one that does not depend on another person's wallet, approval, or sacrifice. Once the behavioral change becomes this widespread and this normalized, the next logical stage is institutional capture, not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the very boring, very predictable sense that institutions always eventually reflect the people who actually pay the bills, staff the desks, and vote with their feet. Universities are among the first major institutions to feel the full downstream pressure. By 2027, 2028, enrollment in traditionally female heavy majors, early childhood education, social work, certain humanities tracks, general liberal arts, is already in visible structural decline in many provinces. Departments that used to comfortably run with 70-85% female cohorts start seeing classes where the gender ratio falls below 60/40ths and then keeps sliding. Administrators respond the only way large bureaucratic organizations know how to respond. They quietly begin to rebrand, repackage, and in many cases completely reinvent those majors so they can be sold to the remaining male students and to the new cohort of pragmatic women who refuse to study something that leads almost exclusively to low paid, emotionally exhausting public sector jobs. New hybrid majors appear with names designed to sound future proof and gender neutral. Behavioral data science, family system logistics management, emotional intelligence engineering, relationship analytics, and conflict systems design. Behind the glossy names is usually the same old content with a fresh coat of statistics, coding bootcamp modules, project management certifications, and corporate sounding buzzwords stapled on top. The rebranding works reasonably well with the pragmatic segment of young women who understand they now must compete on output instead of on gender role signaling, but it does almost nothing to bring back the men who have already mentally checked out of any educational track that smells even faintly of helping professions. The long term effect is that entire faculties slowly shrink, merge, or get quietly absorbed into business schools, engineering departments, and data science institutes. A certain type of soft social science academic career path that existed comfortably for decades simply begins to evaporate, not because of any political purge, but because the customer base, students who are willing to pay tuition and take on debt for those degrees, is no longer there in sufficient numbers. Hospitals, nursing schools, elderly care training programs, and kindergartens feel the same pipeline squeeze a few years later. The traditional oversupply of young women willing to enter those fields at relatively low starting pay had always functioned as an invisible subsidy to the entire care economy. That subsidy disappears very quickly once the women who would have previously accepted those salaries realize they are now responsible for their own housing, their own retirement, their own medical insurance, and their own long term financial survival without a second income to fall back on. Starting salaries in those fields are forced upward much faster than they otherwise would have been. Working conditions must improve, or turnover becomes catastrophic. In some cities, public hospitals and municipal kindergartens start running chronic staffing shortages that can no longer be solved by simply importing more graduates. There simply aren't enough graduates anymore. The government is forced into a very uncomfortable position. Either dramatically raise pay and benefits, which blows up local budgets, dramatically lower entry standards, which creates public backlash and safety concerns, or quietly allow large scale private sector entry into what used to be almost exclusively public or quasi public domains. All three paths are tried in different provinces at the same time, creating a very messy, very visible patchwork of outcomes. Another institution that changes faster than almost anyone predicted is the wedding industry itself. By the late 2020s, the classic mainland Chinese big fat wedding model is in serious structural decline outside of the very wealthiest tier and certain culturally conservative rural pockets. The average wedding cost, once a gigantic multi year savings event for both families, starts collapsing year after year. Banquet halls that used to require 18-month advance bookings now offer last minute discounts of 40-60%. Wedding photographers, makeup artists, MCs, and even the famous wedding planner profession see their effective hourly rates crater because the volume simply isn't there anymore. Many longtime wedding vendors quietly pivot or exit entirely. A whole sub economy of middlemen, decorators, dress rental companies, souvenir trinket manufacturers, and even the famous wedding film drone operators finds itself in terminal contraction. The interesting side effect is that the vendors who survive are the ones who pivot extremely hard toward three new customer types. One, very small, extremely high end, destination micro weddings for rich couples who still want the status but not the 500 guest circus. Two, divorce celebration parties. Yes, this becomes an actual niche market. Three, solo Or friendship milestone life parties where a woman celebrates paying off a house, hitting a career benchmark, completing a major debt clearing journey, or simply turning 35 debt free and single by choice. The third category grows the fastest. A certain type of woman who 10 years earlier would have spent every spare yuan on wedding preparations now redirects that same energy and money into throwing herself a very nice, very well documented I did it alone party. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife, but it is also genuine market adaptation. The financial services industry is another area that pivots aggressively and quickly. Banks and fintech companies that used to make a very comfortable living issuing high interest installment loans for cosmetic procedures, luxury bags, overseas trips, and wedding related spending suddenly see that entire customer segment shrink and become much higher risk. They respond by creating new product lines aimed squarely at the rising class of financially savvy single men and single women who are now obsessed with building emergency funds, investment accounts, and passive income streams. The marketing language changes completely. Gone are the soft focus ads showing smiling couples on romantic vacations. In come very clean, very sharp ads showing a man or a woman sitting alone at a desk, looking at a laptop screen with green portfolio charts going up, or walking through an airport with carry on only, or renovating a small but nicely designed personal apartment. The new aspirational image is no longer couple plus luxury equal sign happiness. The new aspirational image is control plus optionality plus independence equals sign safety. Insurance companies are among the fastest to adapt. Single life insurance products, critical illness policies with no spousal rider requirements, long term care insurance marketed explicitly to people who do not expect to have adult children taking care of them, and even friendship network coverage policies that allow a chosen group of 3 to 5 friends to be nominated as emergency contacts and limited financial proxies. All of these products go from niche experimental offerings to mainstream bestsellers within a handful of years. Actuaries quietly readjust every major risk model because the old assumption that most people over 40 would have a spouse and at least one adult child living nearby simply stops being true for larger and larger percentages of the population. The last major institutional area that gets completely rearranged is religion, or more accurately, the way religious institutions position themselves in urban China. Traditional Christian, Buddhist, and folk religious organizations that used to do very brisk business with premarital counseling, couple blessing ceremonies, and save your marriage retreats, watch attendance at those programs fall off a cliff. The ones that survive figure out very quickly that they must pivot toward three new growth areas. One, individual spiritual development and meaning making for lifelong singles. And two, financial stewardship and biblical, karmic, philosophical money management seminars. Three, community building that does not assume marriage or children as the central organizing principle. Churches, temples, and lay practice groups that make this pivot early thrive. The ones that continue to insist that marriage and procreation are the only spiritually serious adult pathways lose relevance among the urban young adult and early middle age cohort at astonishing speed. All of these institutional adaptations are basically the system doing what systems always do when customer behavior changes permanently. They chase the money, they chase the bodies, and they chase the votes. Nobody in power sat down in a smoky room and decided we must now redesign society around mass male withdrawal. It simply happened because every institution that failed to adapt started shrinking, bleeding money, or losing legitimacy. And every institution that did adapt started growing, making money, and gaining legitimacy. That is the real mechanism. Not ideology, not conspiracy, just cold, relentless institutional Darwinism. The institutional rewiring that began in the late 2020s has now reached its logical endpoint by the early 2030s, a society that no longer pretends the old family centric model is the default or even the majority outcome. What was once a fringe lifestyle choice, lifelong singlehood with deliberate focus on personal sovereignty, has become the statistical norm for urban cohorts under 45. Government censuses in major cities report that more than 55% of adults aged 25 to 44 live alone or in non romantic shared housing, with the number climbing year after year. This is not viewed as a crisis requiring emergency intervention, but as the new baseline that planners, businesses, and even cultural producers must accommodate. The shift is so complete that phrases like settling down or starting a family now carry an almost nostalgic ring, used mostly by older generations or in historical dramas rather than everyday conversation among the young. One of the clearest markers of this new normal is the complete reorientation of the housing market toward modular, upgradable, and highly liquid properties. Developers no longer build speculative mega developments of 3 and 4 bedroom apartments, assuming future family expansion. Instead, the dominant product is the lifetime single unit, typically 35 to 55 square meters, with expandable walls, convertible furniture systems, and built in smart home infrastructure that allows seamless adaptation as needs change over decades. These units are marketed with slogans emphasizing forever flexibility and zero compromise independence. Resale liquidity is a selling point. Owners can easily convert to co living pods or even dismantle and relocate components if they move cities. Banks offer 30-year mortgages on these smaller footprints at lower rates than traditional family homes, reflecting the reduced risk of default when the borrower has no dependents and higher disposable income. The physical cityscape begins to reflect this. More vertical micro towers with shared rooftop amenities, less sprawling suburban sprawl, and a renaissance of walkable urban cores designed for solo pedestrians rather than stroller pushing families. Transportation infrastructure follows suit. High speed rail and urban subway expansions prioritize routes connecting business districts, tech parks, and lifestyle hubs rather than bedroom communities. Car sharing fleets grow exponentially while private car ownership rates among under 45 urbanites drop below 30% in Tier 1 cities. The vehicles that remain are compact, electric, and often subscription based, used sporadically for weekend escapes or grocery runs rather than daily family commuting. Public spaces evolve accordingly. More single occupancy benches, quiet zones in parks, solo workout stations, and even dedicated reflection pods where individuals can sit undisturbed with noise canceling features and charging ports. The design philosophy is explicit. Create environments that make living alone feel abundant rather than isolating. Healthcare systems undergo the most profound transformation because the demographic reality hits them hardest. With fewer children born and fewer marriages, the traditional family doctor model that assumed a spouse or adult children would serve as primary caregivers collapses. Hospitals and clinics invest heavily in AI assisted monitoring, robotic home care assistants, and subscription based elder support networks that allow individuals to pre select trusted friends or professional services as emergency proxies. Palliative care expands dramatically, with emphasis on dignity and autonomy rather than family involvement. Our mental health services pivot towards solitude optimization programs, therapies that help people build fulfilling routines around independence, combat seasonal affective patterns common in single living, and cultivate chosen family networks that function as safety nets without romantic or blood ties. The old stigma around lifelong singleness vanishes entirely. Instead, the rare individuals who marry young and have multiple children are sometimes viewed as the outliers, almost eccentric in their traditionalism. The entertainment industry mirrors the shift with ruthless efficiency. Streaming platforms report that content centered on nuclear family drama or romantic comedies loses viewership steadily, while solo protagonist narratives dominate charts. Series about independent adults navigating career peaks, personal crises, and chosen communities outperform family sagas by wide margins. Dating shows evolve into lifestyle compatibility matches where participants bring financial statements and long term plans to the table from the first episode. Reality formats that once glorified lavish weddings now celebrate milestone solo ceremonies. People throwing elaborate parties for debt freedom, career promotions, or simply reaching a decade of consistent saving. Music shifts too. Lyrics about heartbreak and longing give way to anthems of self mastery, quiet triumph, and the beauty of chosen solitude. The cultural output no longer sells the dream of couplehood as the ultimate fulfillment, it sells the dream of sovereignty. Even language itself changes. New slang emerges around the realities of the new era. Solo stacking becomes shorthand for aggressively building personal wealth and assets. Optionality premium refers to the extra value placed on life choices that keep doors open. Relational tax describes any cost, financial, emotional, temporal, imposed by a partner that exceeds mutual benefit. Conversations about relationships are framed in economic terms almost reflexively. What's the ROI on that dynamic? Or is she adding value or just consumption? The bluntness is not seen as cynical, but as honest realism, a language that matches the lived experience of a generation that watched the old promises fail spectacularly. By the mid 2030s, the societal ledger balances in unexpected ways. Fertility remains low, but quality of life metrics for the adult population improve across multiple dimensions. Self reported happiness scores rise among singles who have internalized independence as strength rather than deficit. Suicide rates among middle aged men drop significantly compared to previous decades, correlating with reduced provider stress and greater control over life paths. Women who adapted early show higher lifetime earnings and asset ownership than their married counterparts, closing gender wealth gaps in reverse. Innovation accelerates as capital concentrates in fewer hands and individuals take bigger risks, knowing they have no dependents to support. The economy grows steadily, albeit slower than the boom years, driven by high productivity sectors and a workforce that remains mobile and unencumbered. The final cultural imprint is perhaps the most profound, the complete decoupling of personal worth from relational status. A person is judged by what they have built, skills mastered, assets accumulated, knowledge acquired, impact created, rather than by whether they have a partner or children. Obituaries no longer default to listing survivors as spouse and offspring. They list achievements, networks, legacies. Memorial services celebrate lives lived on individual terms, with chosen friends and colleagues sharing stories of how the deceased inspired independence in others. The old narrative of dying alone as tragedy evaporates, dying on one's own terms, surrounded by people who chose to be there, becomes the aspiration. This is not utopia. It is simply what happens when a society confronts the arithmetic of a collapsed gender bargain and refuses to pretend the numbers can be ignored. The pain of the transition, the debt traps, the loneliness spikes, the demographic contraction was real and severe. But the outcome is a leaner, more self reliant civilization that no longer wastes resources on illusions. Men walked away because they had to, women adapted because they had to. And the system, in its cold, Darwinian way, rewarded those who faced reality earliest and punished those who clung longest to fantasy. The result is a society that looks strange to the past, but feels inevitable to the present. Smaller families, stronger individuals, quieter streets, sharper minds, and a profound, hard won peace. What did you think about this final arc? The way every layer of society had to bend or break to accommodate the new reality, and how the end state feels both colder and clearer than what came before. Do you see this as the natural endpoint of men walking away? Or is there still room for a surprise reversal? Drop your thoughts in the comments so we can close this out together. Like the video if the whole journey landed for you. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this, and share it if you know someone who needs to see where the road actually leads. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.